to turn to Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. Very familiar verse, we hope. Galatians 2, verse 20. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. What we read here is Paul's personal testimony of the life that he lived as a saved man. Not the life that he always lived, but the life that he lived as a saved man. And what we read here ought to be our testimony as well. We ought to be able to identify with what Paul is saying. Paul, speaking of his life, begins where you would not normally begin. He begins with his death. He's speaking of his life, and he begins with his death. I am crucified, that's death, with Christ. This is where he begins. I am crucified. That is followed by, nevertheless, I live. I am crucified, and I live. You don't see those words together. He says it 3 times that he lives. Nevertheless, I live. He goes on to say, which I now live, and I live. So he begins with, I am crucified. 3 times after that, he states, I live. These are oxymorons, a figure of speech that uses the language of a paradox. A paradox is an expression that at first appears to be a contradiction. It's something that you would not think goes together. I am crucified, I live. But together, though they don't seem to go together, together they communicate a truth. The purpose of a paradox is to get our attention. I am crucified, I live. The English language, of course, is full of these oxymorons. Awfully nice. That doesn't really make sense. It's nice and it's awful. Awfully nice. And you could go on and on. Self-help group. Well, if it's a group, it's not self-help. Self-help books. Well, if you got to read a book, doesn't seem like that's the book's helping you. You're not helping yourself. And you could make a long, long list. But we hear Paul say, I'm crucified. I live. So I want to speak this morning on the crucified life. The crucified life. In this verse, the Christian life is presented. what is stated here is the Christian life. He's writing about living life. In verse 19, he writes about living unto God. So it's living life in the direction of God. And here in verse 20, he says 3 times again, I live. So if you count verse 19, include verse 20, you have 4 times that Paul says, I live. So what we have here is a window into the heart and mind of Paul concerning the way, the manner in which he lived his life. The method, the routine of his living. What we have here is, again, a summation of the Christian life. And it begins with, I am crucified. As you read this verse, it's important. You know, a lot of people whose lives are an absolute mess don't have any trouble telling someone else how they ought to live. That's just amazing to me. But what we have here is the words of a man whose life had a far-reaching influence and a great impact upon God's people and upon the Lord's churches and even upon the unsaved. These are the words of a man whose life was one of widespread encouragement, widespread blessing. His life was an incentive to God's people. His life was an incentive to the Lord's churches. What we read here are the words of a man of godly character. His life was marked by courage and strength and assurance and perseverance. So what is being described here is a life of usefulness, a life that was very meaningful, a very productive, spiritually productive life, a life that manifested and glorified the Lord. And all of that was in the midst of extremely adverse and trying circumstances. So what we read here is the words of a man who knew how to live. And his life was proof that he knew how to live. These are not the words of a man whose life is filled with frustration and disappointment and dissatisfaction. These are not the words of a man who lived a mundane life. His life was not chaotic. His life was not an entangled mess. Today you have people, their lives are an entangled mess, and then they'll say to you, well, here's what I would do. Well, please tell me, because I'm going to do the opposite. Because you obviously don't know. But these are the words of a man who knew how to live. And what we read here is not simply his desire. And it wasn't something that was occasional or sporadic. This was his life. This was his life. And what we read here was not dictated by convenience, was not dictated by circumstance. It was a consistent and persistent way of life for Paul. Notice he says, the life which I now live. So it is his declaration of how he lived his life. And every one of us have a life to live. And every one of us are living that life. And every one of us are living that life a certain way. So we need to make personal examination. Can we say with Paul, as a matter of fact, concerning our own lives, what we read here in Galatians 2 in verse 20? So we want to notice several things about this life. First of all, it is an individual and personal life. As you read verse 20, it does not deal with the plural. It deals with the singular. You read verse 20, and in it there are 8 personal pronouns. I and me. Paul referring to himself 8 times. I and me. He's speaking of life. So with these words, he's speaking of the Christian life. So with these words, he's not viewing Christianity as an institutionalized religion. That's not how he's viewing it. What he's describing is a matter of personal relationship with Jesus Christ. He's speaking of a life that is the result of salvation. Now you think about salvation. Salvation is not collective. Even if you have a group of 100 people that the Lord saves at the same time, each one it is a personal event. Salvation is always a personal event. And so is the life that proceeds from it. We were individually chosen by God before the foundation of the world. Christ died, Christ arose for us as individuals. We were personally born again. We were personally called. We were personally drawn to Christ. We were personally and individually forgiven. We were lost as individuals. And we were saved as individuals. No one was saved in our behalf, and we were not saved on the behalf of someone else. And so it is with the life that proceeds from this salvation. No one can live this life for us. It's individual. Nor can you live it for someone else. You can't force someone to live this life. You can't legislate it. It is personally lived. It is a life that involves personal and individual holiness, consecration, love, and perseverance. And without the personal aspect, there is no Christian life. Secondly, it is a life for now. Notice what he says. He says, the life which I now live in the flesh. A mortal body. The life that Paul is speaking of is not reserved for heaven. It's for now. It's not reserved for a glorified body. It's now in the flesh. It's a life that we live in these bodies. And these bodies are subject to tiredness and weakness and pain and decay, limitations, hindrances of all kinds. But it's a life lived in spite of these bodies. It's a life lived in these bodies. But in a sense, it's a life above these bodies. So it is in these bodies. Don't use your body as an excuse. It's in these bodies that we can live the life that is described in our text. Not only a life lived in these bodies, but it's a life for now. A life for now. I'm afraid there's a lot of God's people who use now as an excuse, who use the ungodliness as an excuse. But we're to live this life now. And right now we can live this life. Our now can change. It does change. Our now may be a time of darkness. Our now may be a time of great need. Our now may be a time of great difficulty, a time of hurt, a time of weakness, a time of sorrow, a time of fear, a time of trial or affliction. Our now may be a time of great perplexity. But regardless of now, what we read here is the life that we should live, and it's the life that we can live. Again, the life which I now live in the flesh. So it is a life lived in natural fleshly bodies of weakness and corruption in the now. In the now. When you think of the life that is being described in these fleshly bodies now, it's a miraculous life. You can't live this life without a miracle. Thirdly, it is a life with a pivot point. The opening phrase is, I am crucified. He begins describing the life that he lives by saying, I have been put to death. I have been put to death. He says, I am crucified with Christ. The word with there describes a position. A position in relation to Christ. Crucified with Christ. Formerly, our position was in Adam. And because Adam sinned, we were born sinners, depraved, and spiritually dead. But now, crucified with Christ. A new position. There's a change. Without this, there is no salvation. Without this, there is no Christian life. This new position and change separates us from our old life. A lot of people, in their attempt to live a so-called Christian life, want to drag in their old life. But you can't live this life without being separate from your old life. I am crucified. Paul stated in verse 19, I through the law am dead to the law. I'm dead. yet I live. I'm dead to the law. Paul stated, Paul, before the Lord saved him, was a very religious man. And he states such in Philippians 3, verses 5 and 6. He said, I was circumcised the 8th day. That is, he possessed the outward symbol of compliance with God. There are lost people who possess the outward symbols of compliance with God. Doesn't make it so. He says, I was the stock of Israel and of the tribe of Benjamin. You see, he thought he had a claim upon God. But now he says, I'm dead to the law. I'm dead to the law. What this means is that part of him that who observed the law has a means of salvation, has a means of justification and righteousness with God. That part of me died. That part of me died. That part of him was crucified with Christ. The law has a means of justification. The law is a means of righteousness ceased to have influence over him. Not that the law ceased to have influence over him, but the law has a system of righteousness has ceased to have influence over him. He was no longer under the bondage of trying to keep the law in order to be right with God. In Romans 6, verses 6 and 7, he said, our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin. For he that is dead is freed from sin, that is, has a master, has a dominating force. We're not free from sin, the presence of sin, but it's no longer a dominating force. It's no longer our master. Romans 6, verse 11, he said, reckon ye yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto God. So we're dead in the direction of sin, but alive in the direction of God. So the life that is being described here is dead, but alive. Dead, but alive. That takes a miracle. That's a miraculous life. I am crucified with Christ. Now, the life being described that flows from that is I live. Fourthly, it's a life with a new identity. I, who I was in the past, am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. And then to clarify, yet not I. It's really not me that lives, but Christ. He has surrendered his identity in Christ. Are we willing to surrender our identity? I am crucified. Yet not I, but Christ. I has been replaced by Christ. That's the only way you can live the Christian life. I must be replaced by Christ. I am crucified. The old life has been nailed to the cross. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ. You see, there's been a transformation. He's saying my old life is crucified, and now life is no longer a manifestation of the old me. Life is now a manifestation of Christ. That's the Christian life. As you read those words, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ. I believe when you get to nevertheless, there's a change in tone. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, there's a change in tone. So what he's saying is, my old life is crucified. But I'm alive. But it's a different life. And it's a better life. You listen to some people, some who profess salvation talk. And they talk an awfully lot about the old life. They talk about it so much, you almost have to wonder, sounds like they miss it. Sounds to me like they miss that life. I'm afraid that's true for many. Remember the Israelites? They wanted to go back to Egypt. Started to miss it. Now, you're in bad shape when you start to miss the old life. So he's saying, I have a better life than I had before. That's true of every saved person. There isn't a saved person that's not true of. Life is better than it was before. There have been people who make this statement. They say, well, ever since the Lord saved me, my life has just been one trial after another. That may be so, but it's still better. It's a better life than what you lived before. He says, my life is better. But it's not I, but Christ. And that's the reason it's better. So read those words over and over. Not I, but Christ. Not I, but Christ. Not I, but Christ. It's living life with an exclamation point. Again, not I, but Christ. That is the Christian life. Paul is saying here, I is no longer the focus. That's the very reason that a lot of people who profess salvation are miserable all the time. Is because I is the focus. I is no longer the purpose. I is no longer the center of attention. I is no longer the emphasis. Listen to people talk. Even when they talk about Christ. Listen. Listen to them. I said this, I did that, I said this, I. And then they might get in there a word about Christ. But I is the center of attention. They're describing their life without even knowing it. I is no longer the emphasis. Christ is now the focus. Christ is now the purpose. Christ is now the emphasis. Not I, but Christ. Paul is saying, if you want to talk about my will and my plans, let's talk about it. It's not I, but Christ. If you want to talk about my interests, my responsibilities, my opportunities in life, it's not I, but Christ. You want to talk about my joys, my difficulties, or my trials, or my calm times, or my storm times, it doesn't matter. It's not I, but Christ. You want to talk about the goals of my life, where I want to be at a certain time in my life, it's not I, but Christ. Not I, but Christ. Well, at age 50, I want to be able to retire. Well, where do you want to be with Christ at age 50? Well, I really never thought about that. Yeah, that's the truth. That's the truth. No matter what it is, it ought to be not I, but Christ. You want to talk about family? Paul says it's not I, but Christ. You want to talk about personal relationships? It's not about I, it's about Christ. Emotions and feelings. Well, that's just the way I feel. Well, it doesn't make it right. It might be the way you feel. It doesn't make it right. Not I, but Christ. And the not I, but Christ proceeds from I am crucified with Christ. You'll never get to not I until I am crucified takes place. So there's a new DNA, a new identity. And the new DNA and the new identity is Christ. And without this, the life that is being described cannot be lived. So in our text, there is I and there is Christ. Two persons, two entities. I and Christ. And every day, something must be done with both. The moment you wake up, something must be done with I, and something must be done with Christ. And what is done with those two entities determines your life. Determines the life that you live. I and Christ. You have to place I somewhere, and you have to place Christ somewhere. And if it is not I but Christ, life is all out of order. It doesn't matter what day it is. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. If it's not I but Christ, your life's out of order. It's very simple. We make it more complicated than it is. There's really nothing complicated about it. You have two people, you have to put them somewhere. You have to do something with them. And it must be not I. So we need to look at our lives and make honest inquiry. Is it I or Christ? Is it more I or more Christ? When it comes to our viewpoints, when it comes to our pursuits, our goals, our attitudes, is it more I or Christ? Examine our attitudes. Is it I or Christ? Well, so-and-so did such and such, and now I have a bad attitude. Well, that's not the reason you have a bad attitude. The reason you have a bad attitude is a spiritual condition. People did a lot of things to Christ. Never once did he give them a bad attitude. Not a single time. If it's not I, you won't have any problem with attitude, regardless of what anybody else does. You won't have any problem with it. If it's not I, but Christ. How much are we willing to get I out of the way? We need to really examine that question. How much room are we willing to make for Christ? Fifthly, it is a life with a new power. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. That is the alternative to I. Not I, but Christ liveth in me. Does not merely say Christ in me. It says Christ liveth in me. Big difference. It is Christ active in me. Not I active in me, but Christ active in me. What's more active, I or Christ? Christ manifest in me. Paul says that the degree of such is that it is no longer I that live. It is Christ alive in me. Think about that. Christ liveth in me. Christ is alive in me. Think about it. The one whose life upon earth served as an example and a pattern, Paul says, liveth in me. Not just in me, he lives in me. He's active in me. The one whose life was pure and holy. He lives within me. The one who always did the will of God, and his only concern was the will of God. He lives in me. He lives in me. It's not I, but Christ liveth in me. The one who was always diligent in doing the work that God had committed to him. He liveth in me. The one who lived delighting in the work of God liveth in me. The one who was one with the Father liveth in me. The one who was victorious always liveth in me. In Galatians 2 verse 8, Paul said the same was mighty in me. Liveth in me, mighty in me. This is the power of his life. It is a life that springs from Christ. It is Christ driving us, empowering us, guiding us, living his life in and through us. Christ liveth in me. So Paul is saying, Christ is alive. And He is alive within me. He lives within me. Notice it says Christ liveth in me. It's not merely Christ is close to me. He's in me. And He's actively inside. Christ is doing the living in my earthen vessel, is what Paul is saying. Christ in me. Christ liveth in me. Oh, what a marvel. And the more that is true, the less of I is manifest. Sixthly, it was a life lived above the earthly. Crucified with Christ, Christ liveth in me, and then notice what he says. The life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God. He's describing a life of contrast. Faith sees beyond what is right in front of us. And he says, I live by the faith of the Son of God. I live by the faith. I live above this earth. I'm not bound to this earth. Paul is saying, my faith takes me beyond this earth. It's a life not confined to earth. Again, we've used it many times. The Bible speaks of eagles, and we're to be like an eagle, soaring above. But sadly, most of those who profess salvation are more like the pigeons and the chickens, always looking for something in the earth. And that's where they live their life. That's the vision of their life, looking at the ground. We're to be the eagles. We're to be soaring above. And that takes faith. It's a life not shaped by the earth. It's sad as we look at our lives, how much of our lives have been shaped by earth. It's truly sad. This is a life far beyond a religious life. Far beyond outward appearance. Far beyond the mechanical. Far beyond an empty form. The shadow of mere religion. This is something beyond surface of theology. Not I, but Christ. This is a life beyond religious cliches and platitudes. It's a life beyond just mental assent to a doctrine. It's beyond a conversion to a system. Not I, but Christ. So you read Galatians 2:20. Oh, what a life is ours to live. Is it descriptive of my life? That's what we have to ask ourselves. Is it descriptive of my life? The life which I now live. Can we say what Paul said here? The life which I now live. We need to look at our life as it is right now and make personal examination. Where is I? Where is it? It's got to be somewhere. Where is I? And where is Christ? Where is the emphasis? I or Christ? What is our identity? I or Christ? I believe that this life that is being described can be lived. Not perfectly, but it can be lived. And it begins with, I am crucified with Christ. You see, if someone was to say to you, tell me your life story. Well, I was born on such and such a day. That's where one part of your life began. But everything changed the day the Lord saved you. And from that point on, it's no longer I, but Christ. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us verse of song. Let's all stand.